Hello, dear friends at Salem Lutheran. Good to be with you this week, the first week in March. Today is the Ides of March, and I welcome you to our weekly message. Thanks for joining me. A couple things that are going on in church. Of course, we are in the midst of the Lenten season, and if you would like some devotions to go along with the Gospel of Mark, we have the Augsburg publication downstairs next to the elevator door. We'll send one to you if you'd like. But it goes along the Gospel of Mark and even beyond what we're doing during Lent. This is the year that we use Mark's Gospel for our lectionary readings every Sunday. So I encourage you to get it, even to continue with it as the year goes on, and refer back to those devotions. Are quite well done. We have our own written devotions from folks at Salem, and they get sent out every week, so I encourage you to read those. Wonderful stories of healing as we focus on healing this day, or this Lenten season. And as we move into the Minnesota Food Share Month, say that quickly, I encourage you to give to neighbors. If you'd like to give it the check to your church, just put on there on the memo line, March Food Drive, and we'll make sure it gets to the proper people to help those who are hungry. Speaking of hungry, Got Change. We've been doing this for some time now, and we're running it through Lenten season for Feed My Starving Children. It's a chance to help the global ministries, as we know that it's important to help those countries in need. I know a lot of their foodstuffs go to Africa, but they go to Haiti, and they even go to some local places as well. So thanks for all of your generosity toward that. Camp Wapo. Almost forgot that. Camp Wapo registration. If you know young people that are interested, please have them get onto Camp Wapo's site right away, because I know the spots will fill up quickly if they haven't already. COVID vaccination. If you have been vaccinated, you don't have to call. It's not a requirement, but if we can have an idea how many people are vaccinated, it will certainly inform us when we can start church indoors again. So if you've been vaccinated, if you would give an email or drop a note in the mail, please don't call. We can't handle that many calls in a short given period of time. So if you just send an email or somehow or another get the message to us. Looking at the things that we're doing, our mission exploration team, that is the team that's putting together our ministry site profile, which will be the guide for our call committee for calling a new pastor. And they're about half done, somewhere in that range. I can't predict. There's some things that change back and forth. They're working on the survey, where we are distilling the surveys so that we can report that, and we will be speaking a little bit about that to the council this week on Saturday. We have a special council meeting then, and looking at some future planning things as well. So we are working on that, and thank you all that provided your input. I know it seems like it's taking a little bit longer than it should, but it takes a while to go through all the information, to get through everybody's comments and such, and so we're putting that together and trying to get a general view of how we move in the future. So that's kind of what's going on in Salem. Our Bible studies, of course, continue on, and we are doing the same text that we are doing on Wednesday and Sunday. So some have wondered if it's going to get a little redundant. Well, we always find new things in the Bible to work through. There's lots of stuff going on in these miracle stories, these healing stories. And this week we are on a particularly long story, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. You know, I've only got so much time. It's about data here. And the longer these videos get, the more difficult it gets to get them through the internet, to publish them and all that stuff. So I try to keep them 10 to 12 minutes at the most. And I see on my timer I've already used 4.5 for the announcements. But some of these things are important, and you need to know what's going on at Salem. And of course, if you ever have any questions, give us a call. Be glad to answer any questions. But this is the healing of the demoniac in a town called Gerasenes And we're not exactly sure where that region is. There's a lot of debate, but there's a really interesting story. I touch on it in my Bible study for the Wednesday Lent session. But it's the story that Josephus tells, and it happens about 10 years before Mark writes his gospel. And that story is about a Jewish revolt, an uprising against the Romans. And it was a brutal, horrific story. And there's mounds of people who've been killed and buried there. And so when Jesus meets the demoniac and he's running around in a cemetery, you can imagine that maybe Mark puts a little of that influence on the story that we hear today. The cemetery must have been massive, based upon Josephus's description. And Josephus, I know I mentioned him in passing, but Josephus is a quite renowned historian for the Jewish history. And in fact, he writes a lot during Jesus' time as well. So we get some perspectives of what's going on with Jesus as well from him. And if you're really a history buff, good reading, good interesting stories about this time in the life of the world in Israel. So Jesus, I'm not going to read everything here, but he steps across the sea and he goes into this new country. Now, what's really unusual, and you got to picture the disciples thinking, where are we going? Because he's going into Gentile land, and that's not very common for the regular Jewish person of that day and age. There wasn't a lot of travel going on that time. They didn't get on a 747 and fly to London or something like that, like we do. And so there's a lot of isolation, a lot of suspicion about the Gentile areas. And so when Jesus takes his disciples there, they have to have a lot of questions. Why would we go there? And sometimes God calls us out to those places that we really are uncomfortable with, a little awkward with. We're not sure how to be around these new people. Anybody who's gone to a global setting like Guatemala or Tanzania, they know that you feel a little out of place, especially when you're in their territory. It's one thing to have them come here and we welcome them into our homes, we have a good time, etc., but to go onto their homeland, their home turf. We had a saying in one of our churches, it was easier to get people to go to Tanzania than it was to cross the Minnesota River and go into the cities. And that can be very awkward for some people as well. They're not used to being in the inner city. It becomes a place where there's suspicion, and people are even scared to go down there. They'll say, oh, I'm not going down there. So here the disciples are taking a big risk following Jesus into this place. And of course, what do they do? First thing that happens, they meet the demoniac in a cemetery, who is everything that the Jewish faith would be against. He's unclean, he's chained, he breaks the chains, they can't keep him down, and night and day it says that he's among the tombs and in the mountains. So there's this wild picture. This could be a great movie setting, of course. And Jesus meets him, and something happens right away, as oftentimes does in these exorcism stories. If you remember when we went through earlier in Mark, when he met the exorcist in the second chapter. But anyway, the first thing he does is says, tell me your name, because name has power. And he says, my name is Legion. And of course, that's a huge group of soldiers, Roman soldiers. It's a Latin word. And so go back in that story with Josephus, and you get some input as to what might be going on in Mark's mind, and kind of an interesting offset of the story. So he comes and and the man is clearly mentally ill in some sort of way. We're not going to try to walk down that path necessarily, but it's a time to think about, mental illness. And during the pandemic, of course, it's been tough. People have been struggling with being socially distanced. And I think it's a time for the church, too, to consider that healing that goes beyond just the physical, but there's something going on, and we'll flush that out a little bit on Wednesday and Sunday. But as we go into the week, I ask that you think about that, and maybe think about folks that you know. Maybe they could use a phone call, a visit, something like that, socially distanced, of course. But it's something that we need to consider as we walk into this text, and then we continue. And then in the end of the story, it's interesting, after he's healed, and it's reminds me of the creation story. You know, you go back to Genesis 1, you hear this creation story where there's this chaos, this void, and just a turmoil, and God creates structure out of that turmoil. And then you hear the story of the demoniac here today, and you see the guy who was running wild in the mountains, breaking chains, just about as exaggerated as you could get. I'm looking for the right word there, not finding it, but nevertheless. And then he is sitting there in his right mind, clothed, and having this very pleasant conversation with Jesus. He says, "Now I'd like to follow you, Jesus." But Jesus does what sometimes we don't want to hear. No, go back to your people and tell them what God has done. Lutherans aren't always very good at that, but nonetheless, that's what the demoniac is told. Go back and tell what God has done for you. Sometimes it's easier to stay with Jesus. Sometimes we'd rather do that. There's times we need to stay with Jesus, but sometimes Jesus points us in the other direction and says, I've got work to do over here, and I'm giving you a commission to tell the story over there. And so we're left at that point in the story. And as we ponder for this week, I invite you to read Mark. It's the fifth chapter, 1 through 20, in that chapter. And take a look at that and see kind of where you fit in that story, because there's a lot of things going on in it, as there are in many of these stories. So if you decide to join us on Thursday at 1 p.m., I'm sure we can find new things to talk about with this story that I don't cover on Wednesday and don't cover on Sunday either. So thanks for joining me. Glad you could be with me, and be still and know that the Lord is God.